Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Today I have on a very special guest. She decided that she wanted to be brave. She contacted me and she said, I feel like I have a story that I want to share. She talks about her own personal struggle with growing up in a family that had issues with substance abuse. She also struggled with being abandoned physically and emotionally by her parents. There were some family rifts that developed as a result of all these things, and she talked about her own healing process and learning how to move through that, and just so that she could be more focused, be more present, and just have an overall better life for herself despite of the circumstances that she grew up in. So Miss Charnessa Pleasant is our special guest today. She goes by the name of Charlie, and I hope that you enjoy her story. I felt like it was a very powerful story, very moving story, and it's the perfect type of story for this podcast, which is why I decided to air it. Because this is an example of someone who's been hurt by love and abuse. And so I hope that you enjoy it. Okay, so I have Charnessa Pleasant, and you go by the name Charlie. So Charlie, please tell us about yourself and what you do.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. My name is Charnessa Pleasant, and I do go by Charlie, just as Natalie said. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm licensed both in North Carolina and in Virginia, but I'm keeping a pretty active practice in Virginia right now. My husband and I, we just relocated back to North Carolina. We're military, so we get bumped everywhere. So, yeah, that's a little bit about what I do. So I'm in private practice, and I'm also doing a little bit of clinical supervision work with a local community mental health agency in the Richmond area as well, too.
So you're in private practice. And which part of North Carolina?
I am in the Fort Bragg area. So I'm right here by the, in military town. So we're stationed at Pope Air Force Base down here. Okay. So we're right in the thick of military world.
I see. Yeah, North Carolina is where I'm originally from. So I know really well, born and raised there. Yep.
Where about?
In Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay.
But yeah, so I was born and raised there, and then I'm a transplant out here in California now.
Okay, wonderful. Wonderful.
So tell us a little bit about the work that you do in private practice, what you do there.
Okay, so primarily, I've been a therapist since 2013. So I'm still fully licensed in 2015, but I've been practicing since 2013. And right now I classify myself, and I think we talked about this a little bit, as more of like a general practitioner, because I'm still kind of getting the feel of the populations that I enjoy work with. So primarily I see a lot of clients individually, but I do have a couple of couples that I work with. So a little bit about what I do. My passion is around working with women, but primarily working with African American women as well too. So I feel like that I'm kind of moving more towards closing my niche and just really being focused on doing clinical work from a women's or feminist perspective
Okay.
that focuses treatment on utilizing a intersectionality or intersectional lens.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what drives the passion behind you being a therapist? What got you started into doing that type of work?
Yeah.
Good.
So prior to even going into the mental health field, I had spent a 15-year career in higher education, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
15 years, and worked with a lot of different institutions, both on the East Coast and the Midwest. I was living in Michigan for about 12 years, and I worked with a few universities out that way.
Mhm.
So being in student affairs, I had a lot of one-on-one time with students. And what
Mhm.
I realized was, as much as I enjoyed the work of acclimating students into university life, whether whether they be first generational students or students that are come from legacies of having families that have been in college, I enjoyed the work that I did with students. But what really drove my my eye to wanting to do mental health work is the conversations that I would have with students behind closed doors. You would not believe the things that students are managing as they're trying to craft a career and identity, all of these different things while in college.
Mhm.
So I recognized, I was just like, I feel like I'm doing counseling work. I feel like that this is happening. So let's just go ahead and, just do the bells and whistles and make this a professional
Makes
career, and haven't looked back since.
makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And your interview with me is going to be a bit of a different interview, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of a different
I think
interview.
it's going to be my first interview of the year, like yours. Well, my first interview on the show. So you're going to be,
Oh, yay.
the first that you decided that you wanted to come on and you wanted to share your personal story.
Right. So,
Yeah.
I had gotten the prompter. I follow you and a couple of other amazing therapists in some Facebook groups that we're in, and I know that you have put a call out about just inviting people to share their stories.
Mhm.
And it was one of the things that prior to making a decision to do this with you, Natalie, it's just something I have been thinking about for a long time.
Okay.
What I've seen that's been coming up in my practice, and what really draws me into the work with women, is the very complicated nature that a lot of women have in relationship to their parents, and more specifically with their mothers.
Yes.
And I've seen it show up in my therapy room. And I was just like, hey, how can I actually talk to anybody about what it means to be the child of having a complicated relationship with your parents if I'm not even willing to share my story?
Sure.
And that's where I found myself. I saw it as a great opportunity to actually share, as to get from on the side of being a therapist and show that therapists are human as well too, and we're not absolved of having any type of things that go on in our background when it comes to our families, when it comes to our kids, when it comes to our spouses or anything like that. We deal with a lot of the same or very similar issues that our clients show up in our therapy room with.
Right.
So I was just like, okay, so maybe it's time for me to share a little bit about that part of my life.
And I can certainly appreciate that. I shared my story on the second episode, and it's a fine line that we have to walk as therapists or clinicians, because in our field they typically tell us not to do that, or they don't
Mm-hmm.
want you to do that. But I feel like it helps people connect with you more. It
Yeah.
humanizes you more, so that you're not seen as this person all the way up here, but you're seen as somebody, oh, you kind of went through some stuff too, and I can relate to you. And so I can relate more, or I can relate with this person. This person knows what I'm talking about because they actually went through it too. And not to say that you can't be a great therapist without going through stuff, but I think there's definitely something more to it when you have been through certain aspects, that your clients can definitely navigate towards you and definitely feel that energy from you.
I totally agree. I think that it normalizes the client. It
Mm.
normalizes us. It's it's an equalizer when we have someone that's walking in our therapy room, that they might know, maybe like you said, not everything, the details of what it may have happened, but if they know that you have an understanding, it equalizes. And we know that clients come in a lot of times wanting to know a lot about us out of the anxiety of, oh, they're going to know too much. Well, I'm sitting on the other end of the couch or the chair and saying, hey, yeah, life happens to us as well too.
And I can't speak for everybody, but I know that for me as a woman, even when I go out and I look for a new doctor, I want somebody that I feel like can relate to me, and
Absolutely.
Typically, and this might sound biased, and I know everybody doesn't agree with it, but I want another woman, and I definitely want another woman of color, because my issues I feel like are going to be different, and so that's just
yes.
And that's not to say that men can't do it or whatever. It's just me and what my comfort level is. And
absolutely.
Yeah, maybe a little bit of OCD too, but whatever.
No, I definitely understand that.
So you have a very interesting story. Your story, part of what you shared with me has a lot of background in abandonment, and there were some addiction issues. So I'm going to let you tell it. You tell us about your childhood and your growing up and what that was like for you.
Okay. Well, that's when I read that question, I was just like, oh, that's such a loaded place to start from, because it can be multiple things at multiple times.
Sure.
But what stands out for me is being of age around the age 12, when I begin to notice that there was some instability happening in the household. I was definitely aware after a period of time that there were some substance issues that were going on, and specifically with my mother, that led to like this total disintegration of what I knew to be my family. And I think with that came, at 12 years old, you don't even have the language to even articulate to anybody how a shift in the environment in that kind of way, when you lose or you go from a 2-parent household to a 1-parent household, to having to stay with extended family members while the remaining parent tries to figure things out. I don't think a 12-year-old has the language to be able to articulate to adults, I need you to check in with me. I didn't even learn that until years later. I need you to check in with me. So while I'm navigating and watching my family unit kind of become very fragmented, I didn't know what to ask about what was happening. I knew what I was feeling. And it was definitely a bit distressing. A bit distressing is actually making it very kind. It was very distressing. It was very, very distressing.
So just so I can clarify, it sounds like were you living in a 2-parent household up until the age of 12?
I was living in a 2-parent household up until the age of 12.
Your mom addicted to something?
I think that she had actually been using prior to that, but I remember there being a period of time where I think my dad had set us down and let us know that, things were going to kind of break apart, or, he wasn't going to any longer be in the household.
Okay.
And
so how many of you were there?
It was myself, my mom, and my dad. My brother and I were about 5 years apart. So actually he was in his first year of college when all of this was happening.
Okay.
So I was 12 and he was 17, 18. So he was actually matriculating out of the house, and I was the last kid that was there.
Okay. And so your dad sat you down and had this conversation. Was it a conversation, or was it more or less like an announcement that, like, I'm leaving because of this?
I think it was more... I think it was an announcement, not necessarily that he was leaving or that my mom was leaving. It was more so of an announcement of, this is happening. This is happening.
Prior to that, did you know that?
I did not. So it was an announcement that this was happening. One of the memories that come up for me, even as I disclose this, I remember sitting in the kitchen and the townhouses that we lived in, where we were gathered around. And when this announcement was made, I remember having a fork in my hand, and we had these leather seats in our kitchen, and I was just poking holes in the seat. I was so angry.
Mm.
And again, just like I said earlier, I had no idea how to express to anybody that these adults are making this decision. And what I've come to later find out that it was probably the best decision that could have been made on my behalf and the behalf of our family. And we can get to that a little bit later on. But as a 12-year-old, all you know is that your dad is moving out. And I'm a dad's girl. I was a dad's girl up until that, up until that
Did he tell
point.
you everything? Did he tell
No,
you that your mom had an addiction? What do you remember? What was said to you?
I remember finding out, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit more. I remember finding out about her addiction. I want to say I was bounced around from a couple of different homes. We went from her mom's house to I went to live with my aunt. No, we went from her mom's house into a house that she had rented that was not too far from the neighborhood that we were originally in, and it was there that I put the two and two together. Okay. I remember seeing drugs on the coffee table in the den area. I remember seeing the little brown crack valves that that the drugs actually come in. The drug of choice that my mom used was both crack and cocaine. Okay. And so I remember seeing those in her bedroom with little broken pieces, or just like maybe like a vanity mirror, and cut straws to snort. Yeah. And so that's when I started to put two and two together, and my mom being very checked out. And even, there were times when she would even communicate, and I think that she was probably in the height of her drug use at this point, where she would bleed from her gums. Just from, when you're using coke and you're rubbing it up here, and, that was happening. And so as a 12-year-old girl, I'm piecing it together. And that was one of the things that really bothered me as I was growing up, and as I began to do my own personal healing work, is that nobody ever talked about the fact that our family broke apart. Nobody ever talked about it. Nobody ever talked about it. And all I knew is that I was bounced around between 4 to 5 different houses. Eventually, my paternal grandmother took me in, my dad's mom. Mm-hmm. She took me in right before I started high school. And the where she was living at wasn't necessarily the best side of town or whatever. But what I do remember was ending up on a twin bed that was posted up in the middle of her living room there. And that's where I was. That's when it all just kind of to start to settle down as far as moving around. But by that time, I'm about 12, 13, 14 years old around this time. I was checked out. I was totally checked out.
I can hear that. And when your dad had that conversation with you guys, was there an option for you to kind of go with him, or was it just like, I'm leaving?
I don't think that there was necessarily an option to go with him, because from what I understand is that he had to work to secure housing. And so where he ended up being during this time was actually in a one room. Okay. We're just talking about one room. Like, I'm in the guest room of our house right now. One room. Mm. And I remember asking him during that time, why I couldn't be with him, because I'm just like, goodness, why can't I be with you? And, him feeling, and I understood it as I got older, but, what would that look like for a young girl and her dad to be in a one room place? Like, I know my dad would never hurt me. My dad has never done anything to hurt me in that regards, but what would that look like publicly? So I think it was just decided that it was in my best interest to go with my paternal grandmother during that time. And that's where I ended up.
Did you understand that decision at that time?
No. Okay. Nope. I didn't understand that decision at that time. All I knew is right before we got evicted from the house that we were in, my dad used to come and get me. We spent time together. but again, we never really talked about what was going on. And my mom would be gone for days. She would actually be gone for days. And I remember, being around 13 years old, and I don't know why this song comes up for me, but this had to have been around the time because I'm a huge music junkie. And what I didn't realize is that music was probably one of the things that was helping me cope throughout all of this. So I remember, who was it? It was Snoop and Dr. Dre 187 that was out. I remember that being out. I remember looking at the video and I'm just like, yeah, blah, 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 just whatever. But I remember that being the big thing during that time. So I remember, just having, when the days that she would be gone, which I now understood were probably during the times when she was drug binging. And, just kind of having to fend for myself, having to wash clothes at the laundromat that was right around the corner, having to try to figure out, what kind of food that we had in the house to cook. Oftentimes being a corner store eater, there was a 7-Eleven that was right on the same place where the washer mat was. So I would wash clothes and then I'll go to 7-Eleven to get something to eat because she would leave me money. And so imagine being a 13-year-old girl and this is actually happening. So this is just one of those things where you're just thankful that more didn't happen that could have happened to a young girl. So I ended up in my grandmother's house. At this point, I was completely checked out. My grandmother and my father had made a decision that the neighborhood that my grandmother was living in wasn't the safest area to be in. So my grandmother actually bought a house in the county so I can be in the suburbs to go to school.
Okay.
Yep.
So it sounds like, the things that come up, the themes that come up for me as you're telling this story is 1, abandonment, 2, instability, 3, just lack of communication. Just no one's really talking to you.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's kind of what you piece together out of that. And I know that there's, I'm certainly not trying to judge or anything like that. And I know that there's probably so many pieces of the story that I don't know. But as you're telling this snippet that I see here, I see someone who's very alone and who is not being talked to.
Yes.
Just everything is unstable. It almost sounds like you don't know what's happening, what's going to happen. You can't really rely on anybody. And it was just, there were no clear messages, no real understanding of what's happening.
No, I think that would be a very accurate description of how I felt alone. Felt very alone. And just kind of unsure of what was happening around me. You're 12 and you're 13, between the ages of 12 and 13, 14, you're kind of coming into yourself. Your body's doing what it's going to do. And you kind of got questions about just life stuff, but those things actually get put on the back burner because you're really trying to survive the circumstances that you're living in. And, and I'll be quite honest, Natalie, there are a lot of things that I did not start to remember until probably about 6 or 7 years ago, as I really started to get really delve into doing the work, just my own emotional work. I think there are things that I just blacked out. I moved through very numbly, very quiet, very shut down. I had everything that I needed. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was well provided for. But emotionally, it was a lot of neglect there. And I think that's just, we're talking about a generation. My grandmother's 85 now. My dad is 64. Okay. So we're talking about a generation of people that you probably don't discuss what's going on. We're talking about a generation of people, if as much as I'm saying that I didn't have the language, they probably didn't have the language either. Or the insight or the knowledge or the emotional intelligence to check in with the kid that goes through something as traumatic as being uprooted and dealing with the loss of a parent. Like I said earlier, we never talked about my mom being gone. Correct. We just knew why. I eventually pieced it together and we knew why.
I think you brought up a very interesting point that a lot of us who grow up in traumatic situations or households, we often tend to forget about, because we move through these phases of processing, right? You talked about not remembering. So maybe, having some effects of PTSD or the psychogenic amnesia, as they like to call it. And maybe there's some feelings that maybe come up for you around your parents, maybe anger, maybe bitterness, or, maybe even just the longing for or wanting acceptance or wanting that chance to connect. That when we go through these ball of emotions and we go through these phases of PTSD, we forget that our parents were doing the best that they could do, despite how dysfunctional they were. They're just doing the best that they knew how to do. There's no handbook on parenting, and I'm certainly not trying to excuse what you went through. What I am saying, though, is that sometimes people just don't have those tools there.
Right. And I think, and that wasn't, I didn't develop that level of compassion until I started doing my own work, until I started growing up. I'll be 40 this year. So, I've had some life experiences under my belt. I've had some things that I've gone through. And then the more that I've grown into going to live life, I recognize how you can really make some fucked up decisions. You can make some poor choices. Excuse my language. I don't know if I can cuss here, but I curse. But, I recognize how you can use substances to check out. One thing that is really interesting to me, and I think I had talked to you about whether or not this would be a niche area in my therapy work. And I think that it absolutely could be, because I see it in my office all the time, is that we don't know our parents' stories.
We don't.
We don't know their stories. I have no idea. Like, as I begin to do my own healing work, I begin to do my own therapy work, and I know we'll get to that a little bit later. That was the one thing. That's where, when I understood that I didn't have all of the pieces and I didn't have their story, I might have a little bit of some things. But once I realized that I didn't have all of the story, that's when my heart space opened with compassion. And was able to move into a space of being able to see my parents as human beings, making the best of this entire situation. That they knew how. And me and my dad, we've gotten to a moment when we gotten some resolve. We've had to have some tough conversations, over the years, and it's really interesting because we talk about the emotional neglect and the abandonment. Even though I had my dad there was still a lot of emotional neglect because he didn't know how. All he knew how to do was to provide for his two kids, one that was in college, one that was in high school that would eventually go on to college, and make sure that we were okay on that front. All this other emotional fuddy-duddy stuff,
nothing.
That's not his deal, and even to this day at 64, that's really not. He's definitely much more softer man than emotional, but during that time,
no,
his thing is that I got my kids through some really shitty shit. And if you're able to ever step back and see it, please understand that your mom left me as a single parent to raise two kids, and I did the best that I can, or that I could during that time. But again, when I was young, I didn't give a shit about that. That wasn't my thing. That wasn't my load to carry. And it should never be the load to carry for kids to understand why their parents make poor choices. But there is a place that as you grow, you can grow into a space of compassion for them.
So, yeah, and I would agree to that. And I also think that you made it very clear that you have to get treatment, because you got to be able to step outside of yourself and your own emotions, and that requires a level of insight, right? In order to have compassion and forgiveness, or even just acceptance, that requires you to step back and look at it from an objective focus, which it sounds like you've done a lot of work around that. Objective, and take your emotions out of it and say, it was very hurtful. I was angry. I didn't understand it. but this is why it happened, and this is the understanding and the clarity I got from them. Whatever happened to your mom? So your mom, she sounds like she spiraled out of control with her addiction.
Yeah, so my mom spiraled, continued to spiral out of control. So I'm thinking about, I'm trying to put this in a sequence for you. So 14, I arrived, 13, 14, I arrived at my grandmother's house. I ended up moving to the suburbs to go to the schools, to continue in the school system that I already was in. All through high school, very little to no communication at all. And what should have tipped me off was my maternal grandmother, who is now deceased, ended up going to my grandmother's house when we moved to the county, and actually had the audacity to ask my grandmother, why are you taking care of Charlie? Why are you choosing to house her? And at that age, again, didn't have any insight, didn't even really think about that until I got much older and started doing my own therapy work. That should have tipped me off a little bit about what my mom might have experienced as a young girl growing up under her own mother. For another mother or another grandparent to ask another grandparent why they're taking care of their grandkids. And for my grandmother, it was a no-brainer. This is my son's daughter. This is going to happen regardless, and I remember her coming to the house and me being deathly afraid that they were going to remove me again. And, my grandma giving me the best reassurance that she could at that time to say, no, you're here. And I ended up staying there until I went to undergrad. But yeah, that should have tipped me off a little bit into maybe some of the issues that my mom might have had to deal with in being the child of her own mother. But I pieced these things together over the years as these memories started to come back to me. But at the time I couldn't put those things together.
Right. And so how old were you when you remember your mother coming back into your life?
My mother actually never came back into my life.
Wow.
My mother left, let's see, it was around 12. I think I might have saw her once, maybe like in 1999, 2000, right before I moved to Michigan. I moved to Michigan in 2002 and I was there until 2013. She was hospitalized. And I ended up going to the hospital to visit with her for a very brief time. And I remember that just being a really, really shitty visit. And I've always made sure that my mom had my telephone number. But we never reconnected. And I'm actually okay with that. And maybe we'll talk about that as we go a little bit on in the interview, because that's one of the things that's really important for me when I work with my clients who deal with having challenging relationships with their parent, is that it never oftentimes may tie up in a bow. We may never get that story ending that people think that we should have. Sometimes it really is about moving through life the best way you know how, not realizing that you may not ever be reconciled or have the type of relationship with your parent that you keep the fantasy that you want. And that was a big part of the work, is having to break the fantasy of what you thought it should.
I do,
Of having to break the fantasy and helping clients to hold on to the desires. There's nothing wrong with the desires. It's the fantasies that keep us stuck. But just knowing that, this might not, you might do your work and you might heal and you might go on. It doesn't mean that you'll ever be reconciled with your mom. It never, or whatever parent that's been the challenge for me. It never means that I might be reconciled with my mother. And so when I ended up moving to Michigan, I remember getting a phone call from her then. And I think that this is when I started to really put up the boundary between she and I. She actually called me. And I mean, she wailed on me. I mean, completely wailed on me and screamed on me and actually blamed me for not getting her the treatment help that she needed.
Wow.
Why? And I remember sitting on the other end of the phone, and I said it just as I said it, as I'm saying it now. I was 13 fucking years old. What was I supposed to do? And I remember hanging up the phone right after that. And I was just like, this has got to stop. Like, whatever this is, this has got to stop. And I think the last time that I heard from her, she had left a voicemail on my cell phone in 2012. You know, Charlie, you know, I'm your motherfucking mother. This is that, then the third, you know, how dare you not to, I mean, just this sense of entitlement that I owed her something. And and my husband didn't believe it, because my husband comes from this very close-knit family, and which also freaked me out when we first started dating, because I was just like, what the fuck is this? You know, people actually like, you know, people actually fight and survive and get through this. So this is true, you know. Which is also another thing that I work with my clients about when they seek those or find themselves in really, you know, I don't want to say stable relationships, because even, you know, families fight, but in relationships with a family dynamic is much different than the one that you're accustomed to. And I let my husband listen to it, and he was just like, I can't imagine. I cannot imagine. I was just like, this has been to, you know, my life, you know, when she shows up, you know, the times that she's shown up over the years, it's been a lack of accountability and responsibility, for, you know, for her role and how things played out. And one of the things I remember telling her when I did speak to her is that, you don't get to call me to talk to me about how bad my dad is. What I do understand is that regardless of what your relationship was, my dad was the parent that remained and chose to parent the best way that he knew how. So you don't get to call me and unload on me. You get to figure out to do it another way, because what you would want me to understand does not supersede the fact that I've been greatly impacted by your actions. And I can't separate that space at all. Like at this point, I'll never get reach the level of understanding that you want me to have, because I'm the product of the decisions that you've made. So that doesn't get to separate from me.
Did she ever sober up?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. Over the years, I've kept in contact with her best friend. And when I say kept in contact, I say that pretty loosely. We don't talk every day. I actually checked in with her last year sometime, and I had actually thought about, you know, arranging some time to actually visit with my mom. I was living back in Virginia for a year because my husband was deployed overseas. And so I had gone back home, and I was just like, well, maybe this might be the time to kind of sit down and just kind of see. And every time I went to go do it, I was just like, this does not feel right. This doesn't feel right. I don't know how you make space for a person who has been out of your life for 24 plus years. And I don't say that from a place of like spite or resentment. It's from a place of, I don't know you. I don't know you. And I don't know you. And I'm very clear is that I don't trust you with anything emotionally concerning me. So I don't know what a meeting or how effective a meeting would be, because I don't know you and I emotionally don't trust you. And I'm okay with that. I wish you well. I'm okay with that. But no, we never reconciled. There's been no reconciliation, but I have asked about her from time to time. The area that my mom lived in, we still have a lot of family members around there that give us updates sporadically. From what I understand is that over the years, the substance of choice moved. It might have moved from, well, I understand that it moved to alcohol. Now, I don't know if she stopped using other substances or if it was the crack and cocaine plus alcohol. But I do remember hearing that alcohol was a big part of her life at this point.
When did your dad kind of come back in and be more of a stable constant?
I actually never really lived. I never lived with my dad after the age 12.
I see.
I stayed with my grandmother the entire time up until when I went to VCU. But he was always there. My dad was always there. But it was still with the understanding that we're never going to talk about what happened. And it was with the I think it was done to protect me but it probably wasn't the best decision looking back, because kids always know. But my dad has always been there. I think we finally had a come to Jesus moment. Actually, it was a couple of Father's Day, a couple of years ago. And we were standing in the kitchen. My dad has since remarried. Couldn't love my stepmother more than I do. She's an amazing woman. I remember the very first time that I met her, and literally I had gotten out the car. I had come home from college the weekend, and I gotten out the car and I met her. He had brought her over to my grandmother's house to meet both my grandmother and myself. And I knew instantly, I was like, yeah, she's going to be around. And so she's been around since 1999, and they just got married a year ago, Thanksgiving. So, and so, he's had an opportunity at love again, which has been amazing because he deserves that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what I remember from the conversation that we were having in the kitchen, and, there were some tears, from both he and I, is that for him, it was, I never thought that you had the capacity to understand what was happening. And my feedback to him is that I always knew. And I told him very, very honestly, the part of me that resented you, there was a huge part of me that resented you for never checking in with me emotionally. And so over the years, our relationship was impacted by that. Because like I told you earlier, I was a daddy's girl. Like, I mean, you couldn't get me from up under my dad. Like, you couldn't pry me off. And then all of a sudden, it's this total disconnect. And then there wasn't any, real, what I thought were real efforts to reconcile us.
Mm-hmm.
So even in some sense, even though my dad is my dad, and we have a great relationship, there's a part of me that doesn't know him because I lost the benefit of getting to learn him as I grew up, and vice versa.
Right.
Vice versa.
And it sounds like the one positive thing for me that stands out, well, a couple positive things that stand out in terms of the theme of the story, is that you did have a stable person that was a surrogate, essentially, which was your grandmother. And so she was always there, and she was always, dependable, it sounds like. And then you and your dad, I mean, despite him not necessarily being stable or being in a place where he could keep you, he was still there for you the best of his abilities.
Absolutely.
It sounds like that made it easier for you to work through things with him. Not necessarily easy, but easier to work through something with someone who's going to be there, and he can forgive or accept, that from a person who's still going to be there. They have their issues, but they're still present, and they want to be present. I'm curious because we actually have a few more minutes.
Okay.
In terms of tell me more about the work you did around your mom, right? Because she's gone, she never came back. And for a lot of people, that's a huge thing, that abandonment, that lack of closure. There's like that door that's like there and it hasn't fully shut. There's a big question mark. There's still all of, there may have been all of those feelings there, but just not having that closure, never hearing from that person never checking in with you.
Right. So it all came to a head, and I've actually never discussed this. I've never told this story outside of the people who were there.
Okay.
It all came to a head. So God be with me as I even share this for people to consume it.
Yeah.
It all came to a head for me I started working with the therapist that I work with now in 2008. I have finally found somebody who was amazing. And like I said, I've been with my therapist for 10 years. Yeah. I have an amazing relationship with her, which is another reason why I chose to go into this field. Because I'm like, Lord, if it can happen for me, I'm thinking I'm like this total, just hard nut to crack type of situation, but just understanding that, that it is possible to move past these or move through these things. But anyway, so it all came to a head back in 2009. I was having a really, really difficult time emotionally regulating. And engaging in some behaviors that were risky.
For people who don't know what emotional regulation is, can you kind of break that down just a little?
Okay, so emotional regulation is, I don't have the actual definition of it, but what I can tell you is that I had a very hard time being and sitting with myself in a very comfortable way.
Right.
I felt very anxious. I felt very depressed. I felt very agitated, irritated. I can give you a lot of the symptoms of the things that was happening, but the best way I can describe it is that I had a really hard time being with myself, and I didn't know why. I had no idea. This actually landed me in the emergency room at the University of Michigan, which eventually turned into a 72-hour hold at a mental health institution. So I was there for 72 hours, and there is something very interesting that happens to you when you lose your rights to govern yourself and you have no say-so about what happens with you. All I remember happening that night was sitting in the emergency room waiting to be transported to the facility that they were taking me to. The receptionist was amazing. And even when I look back on it, I think that it was all orchestrated to get me to exactly where I was. I was in one of the best facilities that I could have ever been in. When I finally got there and I finally calmed down, because I went there and I was just hysterical. I was crying. I was upset. I was scared. All of it was because I was scared because I didn't know what was happening. But when I finally settled down, it was the first time in my life that I can ever remember the feeling of what it meant to take care of myself. And I did it for 72 hours. And something happened that kicked in for me immediately. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I knew who I needed to call. And I had some very, very close people that walk with me during that process that I was able to contact and be like, hey, I need you to call my job, let them know that I'm going to be out as a medical emergency. I need somebody to get on the phone with my therapist because I still had an outpatient therapist at this time. I need somebody to get Tracy on the phone and let her know that I'm here. And it was done. And I remember the staff member that came in, asked me, she was just like, no, I was actually sitting out in the, I don't know why I want to say Lanai. I love the Golden Girls, but that's a sidebar. But my idea of the Lanai, it was, like I said, it was a very beautiful facility.
Right.
But something as intense for that to happen, I couldn't have had a better place to have done some recovery. And I remember the social worker, the therapist coming out there talking to me, and she sat beside me, and I'm just sitting out there, and it's just quiet. It's these beautiful flowers, these trees, and I'm just in this real reflective place. And she looked at me, and she was just like, Charlie, you do not belong here. And I was just like, long term, no. Right now, absolutely, I do. This is exactly, like, my life had to come to neck breaking stop in order for me to see that if I didn't get a hold on my emotions, that this was only going to intensify more. And so she was just very clear. She was just like, she was just like, you don't belong here. I've definitely seen worse cases, than this. I mean, she was just very personable, except for this bullshit psychologist that was there and just hiss on her. Like, okay. I think I cussed her out like 3-4 times when I was there, because she was just a piece of shit. And just having no idea how to interface with Black women and people of color overall. Just very kind of stereotypical. And at this time, I'm in grad school working on my MSW. So I'm like, you can't run, I'm doing the work that you're doing with me. So I'm not that easy for you to run stuff past. And so I remember later, during the time I was there, I met some amazing people that was there. I got to order my food 3 times a day. I had to go to group sessions, and I was I can't believe that it's actually, this is a space where I get to actually focus on me. And, but I do remember having a nurse or an attendant or somebody come in there and ask me, do you want to call somebody to come bring you a change of clothes? And I was just like, no. And they was like, well, why not? I was like, oh, I'm not going to be here long. I was just like, this is a very, in my mind, I'm thinking, and I knew it. I was in a space of knowing, and I had never been there before, but I knew that this needed to happen, but this wasn't going to be long term. And I had a couple of friends that came by. I have a really good friend who's an ER doctor at U of M, and he came by to visit. And I had a really good girlfriend who was actually one of my bridesmaids in my wedding, who would just come sit with me during that first and second day. All she would do was just hold my hand. That's all she would do. And because that's all I needed. I didn't need anybody to tell me that I needed to fix something that was going on with me. Looking back on it now, I was actually having the responses that I think I needed to have that I couldn't have because I was so checked out as a young girl. I didn't know how to feel any of that stuff back then. And I think it just happened right during that time. Mm-hmm. So, went there, did my thing, went to groups, and I, definitely recognized it as a turning point. But actually I had a lot of shame around even admitting to people that that's where I was. Like, God, you really went? Yeah, I went. And so everybody will know once they listen to this is that, yes, I did. And I'm okay with that. Judge if you will, mm-hmm. I'm actually okay with that. That's my journey.
Actually very humbling.
Yeah. That's my journey. Mm-hmm. So once my psychologist had, not my psychologist, but my outpatient therapist had coordinated with the social worker that I was working with at the facility, at the inpatient unit. And I got out in 72 hours, under her care. And that's when I really got serious about doing my therapy work. Okay. And I remember shutting it down. I shut my life down for 2 years to do very intense individual and group work.
Good for you. Good.
Yep. 2 years. I was like, anybody that knew me knew where I was on a Friday night. I'm not hanging out, because what happened when I was at the inpatient unit is that I got a glimpse of what emotional peace felt like.
Good.
And I was just like, okay, this is what I'm after. This mm-hmm. feels good. Mm-hmm. And then from there, like I said, I did very intentional and very intense work with my therapist, both individually and in group. And it saved my life. And it gave me a space to understand mm-hmm. that my voice mattered, my concerns mattered, how I felt mattered. Poor behavior that I might have demonstrated had a root cause to it that I understood. My anger was validated. My sadness was validated. And at that time, that's when I did receive a diagnosis of major depressive disorder with PTSD. And so the PTSD was absolutely there. And I was just like, and so once I finally got it, I was like, this now it makes sense. Now all of this makes sense. And so therapy for me has just been affirming in a way of just reminding me of it was absolutely okay for you to have felt the way that you felt about what you experienced. It was absolutely okay for you to have broken down emotionally the way that you broke down. And it was absolutely okay for you to take the time out to take care of yourself.
That's awesome. I think you shared an amazing story. I almost feel like there should be a part 2, but we're out of time. I think the listeners are going to love it. I love it. And it's very humbling. How can people connect with you if they want to reach out to you and talk to you more?
Absolutely. So I had mentioned, unfortunately, my website is under construction right now. Mm-hmm. We are working on that now, but I can be reached at The Healing Collab, COLLAB @gmail.com. Or you can find me on Facebook on my business page is www.facebook.com/The Healing Collaborative, PLLC.
Okay.
And that's my practice name. It's The Healing Collaborative. Great. And what I love about that is that I do focus on the importance of what it means to heal in community, because mm-hmm. we can't do it by ourselves. And it's a, the ugly, the good, bad, and ugly, we absolutely need people to do this work with, and mm-hmm. we don't do it in a vacuum, and we don't do it by ourselves. And healing is ugly, and it doesn't feel good all the time, but in community. is when I think that we can, we can make a great impact. So I can be found on Facebook, The Healing Collab, PLLC, or listeners can email me at thehealingcollab@gmail.com. And I'll send this information to you again.
Okay, great. And then last question.
Okay.
Do you have any resources or books or things that you feel like were helpful for you that you would recommend for people?
Resources. I mean, obviously therapy. I'm a huge advocate for therapy. And really finding the therapist that you connect with. I don't care if it takes you to go through 3, 4, 5, 6 different therapists. For what you need to unload, you need to be in the face or in front of somebody that feels good to you, that feels good to your soul, that honors your energy. So I definitely encourage listeners or anybody that may hear this, that therapy is a huge resource that you can utilize. And we are out here to help and to support you. NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, I know that they do a lot of work with setting up groups for children who are children who've been impacted by parents who have substance abuse issues, either prior to or currently going through it. NA does the same thing. AA does the same thing for kids as well. So those are just a couple of resources that come to mind for me right now. The therapy modality that I lean towards in my practice is internal family systems and dealing in parts work. And I became introduced became familiar with that modality because that was actually the treatment modality that my therapist used with me. And it was the most compassionate and most honoring of self treatment that I've ever come across. So if you just want to pick up on some information like introductions to internal family systems work, I would suggest that to some readers, to some listeners. But just going out there and just, doing a quick Google search is, it's our friend, and we can come up with a lot of different, good resources. Just tapping into a network in your area to find out who's working with a good therapist. Word of mouth is sometimes better than, just kind of thumbing through and just picking a person. But those are the 3 resources, including the reading, that I would recommend for anybody that's looking to ready to live. I knew how to survive. My grandmother and my dad were very good at teaching me how to survive. What I just recently learned how to do is start living. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being brave and sharing.
Thank you.
Lovely story. I love it. And I know my listeners are going to love it. And I definitely think people are going to want to reach out to you and connect with you, because I think this story connects with a lot of people.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for having me, Natalie. I appreciate that.
Sure. Okay. Well, that was Charlie's story. I would love to hear what your thoughts are on that story. The story, it caused me to want to pause and reflect and just really, truly, it was one of those stories that resonated with me. And I really enjoyed talking to Charlie. I learned a lot from her, and I think she's very strong and very resilient, and just overall beautiful person. Let me know what your thoughts are. I want to hear you reach out and tell me what you think. Definitely give me some feedback for the show if you have any at adatewithdarkness@gmail.com. Also, come on over and join my humble group, A Date with Darkness group on Facebook. Of course, the link is in the show notes. Would love to have you chat with us. The group is growing. Also, the podcast is growing. So my subscriber list is growing, and I'm loving it. So I definitely want to continue this conversation with you, chat with you again next time. Also, be sure to check out the YouTube channel, A Date with Darkness, as well, because I'm going to be posting the interviews on YouTube. So you can now see what it looks like for me to do these interviews live, if you're into that sort of thing, which most people are. So I hope to hear from you next time. And as always, be well, and thank you so much for listening.